This is the second video on the series on promise. In our first video, we understood difference between synchronous call and asynchronous call. In this video, we are going to understand promise object in detail. So let's get started. In previous video, we understood that when we make an async call is going to return a promise object. We try to understand that using one scenario. So consider there is one web page which has a button called Get Employees. When we click on this Get Employees button, one event handler called handle click employees will get called. So that event handler will be executed on JavaScript thread. On click of this Get Employees button, handle click employees will be called. It is an event handler whose implementation is shown in this green box. So this handle click employees, it calls get API data, which is a wrapper function for making an API call using fetch. Can be shown like this, where inside this event handler we are making call to get API data. So this is that get API data, which is an implementation of get API data, which is a wrapper to fetch API. Our wrapper function get API data that makes call to fetch API. When we make call to fetch API, that fetch implementation will be executed on a separate thread that will be executed on a browser thread, which is shown here, and it is going to return a promise object. Now the moment we call the fetch API, it immediately returns promise object. Because the API data is not available at that point, so it cannot return API data, because API data will become available at some later point. So when we make call to this async function, it immediately returns a promise object. So two things are happening. One is JavaScript thread and another is a browser thread. Execution of this call is happening on the JavaScript thread, but when we make call to fetch API, a separate browser thread will be created. The execution of fetch will happen on that thread. It happens in this way so that our JavaScript thread does not get blocked. Once the fetch API gets API data from API server, it will provide that API data via fetch callbacks to our JavaScript thread. And once JavaScript thread gets that result, it can display that result on user interface. So basically, when we make an async call, the execution of that async call will happen on a separate thread. Once the execution of the async function get completed, using fetch callbacks will get response of the API data. Now let's see what is this promise object that we get as a result of this async call. So promise is an object that represents future event. So whenever we make an async call, what we are getting is one promise object, which is actually a wrapper to the promise result. So we can also say that promise is a proxy for a value that is not known when promise is created. So whenever this promise is created, which tells that I'm giving a promise that I will provide you API data, but I will provide API data in future. So that's why when promise is created, it will not contain any result. So that's why this result is shown with this question mark. So this promise is a wrapper or a box on a value that will come in future. We can understand this promise with an analogy. Say, father promises his son that if you score more than 80% in 12th science exam, I'll get you a motorcycle. So getting 80% or more marks will happen in future, but father is giving promise before that event happens. So this promise is a return value of async function. So whenever we make call to an async function is going to return a promise object. The promise object will contain one member called promise result that will become available in future. Now we can question that if you make a call to async function, why we return a promise object? So whenever we make call to async function, the async function is asynchronous. That is, how much time it will take, that is not known. So that's why the async function returns a promise object immediately. So because result is not available immediately, asynchronous method returns a promise object. So basically this promise object promises to provide result in future whenever it becomes available. Content of this promise result will change depending upon when promise gets settled. We need another data member called promise state to represent what is the current state of the promise. The promise object also contains promise state variable along with the promise result variable. and the state of the promise will change depending upon the progress of this fetch implementation. So there are three possible states of a promise object. One is pending, second is success, third is failure. This is the promise object which has two members. One is promise state, second is promise result. Whenever we create a promise object, the state of the promise will be pending. If that asynchronous call was successful, the state of the promise object will become as fulfilled. And if that async call was not successful, there was some failure, for example, could not get data from API server, so in that case the state of the promise object will be rejected. So there are three possible states: pending, fulfilled, and rejected, or say pending, success, and rejected. Now let's understand that how value of promise result changes. So as we understood earlier that when we create a promise object, initial state will be pending and promise result will have no data, or promise result data member will have no result or no data. If promise is successful, that is API call is successful, state of the promise object will change to fulfilled, and whatever was the result of the API call, that will be placed in the promise result data member. If API call was not successful, so in that case the state of the promise object will be rejected, and whatever was the result of the API call, say if it is error, so that error information will be placed in this promise result data member of promise object. In next video we'll understand how to create this promise object, and we'll understand that when we create a promise object, initial state will be pending, and when promise is successful, we'll find the promise state as fulfilled, and the result of that promise will be placed in this promise result variable. And if promise is rejected, we'll find the promise state as rejected, and whatever was the result like error condition will be available in this promise result. So this is about what is a promise. In the next video we'll understand what are different ways to create promise object. Thanks for watching and happy learning.